Okay, hi everyone. I see the participants continue to increase. Okay, so it's 2 o'clock on the dot. Let's get started. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Aletha M, and I'm a professor at California State University, Stanislaus. Yeah, I am also a global educator, and I'm just so happy to have you all here today for my series titled Transformative Conversations, Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Education and Beyond. Today's talk is going to be with Dr. Ivory Toldson, and he's going to be talking about America's past atrocities and focusing particularly on the U.S. government's role and complicity in destroying Black lives and livelihood. This talk came about because on MLK Day, which is a federal holiday where we typically celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Toldson, he wrote this brief essay and posted it online where he was talking about 5 times the U.S. government was complicit in destroying Black lives and livelihood. And I really liked what he wrote, and so I contacted Dr. Toldson and I said, let's talk about this in more detail. And here we are today doing it, so we're making it happen. So let me go ahead and give Dr. Toldson a proper introduction here before we jump right in. We only have an hour with him, everyone, so I'm trying to be cognizant of his time because it's kind of late for him. It's in the early evening for him right now. So Dr. Toldson, hi.
Hi.
Yes. Okay, so everyone, Dr. Toldson, he's the president for Quality Education for Minorities. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education, which is a very prestigious journal. He is a full professor at Howard University, which is a historically Black university and very well-known Black institution. He is the former executive director for the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And this is a position that he was appointed to by former President Barack Obama. So someone said they can't hear me very well. Can you hear me now? Is this better? I tend to have, I can have a soft voice. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you so much. All right. Dr. Toldson, he has also served as a senior research analyst for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And I can go on and on about all of the many hats that Dr. Toldson wears, but we really just don't have that much time. And I'm going to trust you all to Google Dr. Toldson to learn more about him. He's just such an amazing scholar and a highly esteemed scholar. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Toldson.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Harven.
Yes. Okay, so let's jump right in. So again, with this essay that you wrote, you talked about, you first started with United States slavery. And you talked about how that started before 1526 and it ended in 1865. And you stated how 12.5 million Black people were transported to the Americas. And 2 million died along the way. 4 million Black people, so 89% of the Black population, were enslaved at the time of the U.S. Civil War. So my question for you is there anything in particular regarding our U.S. government that you feel is critical for us to understand or keep in mind as we study this particular period in time for Black people and as we think about how slavery still impacts the Black community today?
Yeah, and thank you so much for opening up this dialogue. I think it's important for us to understand some of the ways in which our nation is growing and what's our responsibility to help our nation grow in a way that's healthy and conducive to accommodating the diversity that exists, and what are some of those ways that could stun our growth and can keep us really going in the wrong direction. There was a recent debate regarding the 1619 project. And that was a project that shifted our view of how we look at this nation to not starting with independence, but really starting back to when the first recorded enslaved people were brought to this country. And right at the end of the previous administration was that were taken to reduce the impact of this and to really try to sell an agenda and a piece of propaganda that we should not look back, that we should look forward, and that looking back at the things that that the United States government did that hurt so many people in so many horrible ways would in a sense create friction and division. But it's important for us to really understand how we need to use these past stories to grow. Now, throughout everything that I listed, from back in during the times of slavery to the most recent actions that I discussed, there's always been people of conscience that was either very close to the U.S. government in proximity or within the U.S. government that was advocating for the right thing. And I think that by us not acknowledging some of the horrible things that happened back then, we also shut down very important voices that could act as a spirit and a model for the types of voices and the type of leadership that we need in this country today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toldson. I appreciate what you said. Something else that you brought up in your writing was, in what you wrote, was about the post-Reconstruction massacres. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, because, once slavery ended, we did enter into this period of Reconstruction, and I was hoping that you could talk about what that meant for Black people, and so why, and so when there were these post-Reconstruction massacres, what did that mean for Black people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did see your message that there may have been some connection instability. So that, let me know if that continues, and I'll try to move closer to my router, and also try to kick my children off of streaming and all that kind of stuff. So the story of Black people is very, very profound, and it really gets undermined quite a bit. So, just going back to the period of slavery through Reconstruction, there's a few things I think is important for us to really understand. So the United States became independent in 1776. And it was during this time when the United States made an autonomous decision to retain slavery, whereas the country that they had some sovereign to prior to 1776 ended slavery a good 50, 60 years before the United States did. Now, a lot of times Black people are seen as passive actors in this whole thing. But from that period where the United States gained independence to the emancipation of slavery, there were Black people who was active in exploring ways to end slavery, both those who were enslaved and those who were free. Right at the start of the Revolutionary War, there were people, including Crispus Attucks, who was fighting on both sides of that conflict. You had those who made the strategic decision to fight with the British because they thought that that would end slavery quicker. And there was those that fought on the side of the revolution because they thought that if Black people were there.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, we lost Dr. Toldson. Okay, we lost Dr. Toldson. Oh no. Okay, he'll probably come back. So hold on. Technology, can you all hear me now? Is this better? You know what? Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for being patient. I tend to have, hi Larry, I see your hand. I tend to, I guess I have a soft voice. I never really thought of it before. I'm always teaching, and I thought I was loud for my students, maybe not. Larry, hi.
You also had people like Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, and many other people who was really making the entire system of slavery untenable. You had people who was setting up maroon colonies off coastlines in states like North Carolina, Louisiana. You also had the settlement, the Negro Fort that happened in Florida, where you had a General Garrison, Black men who set up cooperative agreements with the Seminoles, took over a cache of weapons that the Spanish left behind during the War of 1812 and led raids on Southern plantations during that time. So there are estimates that leading up to the Civil War, about 300 Black people were escaping slavery each month. So if you think about a system where 300 are escaping per month, and they're doing things like going up to northern free states and fortifying the resistance through the abolitionist movements. They're partnering with white people like John Brown and going to attack Harper's Ferry, which is seen as the first battle of the Civil War. They're creating maroon settlements and all these types of things. So it wasn't white people freeing Black people from slavery. It was Black people making slavery untenable. So, when we think about, prisoners of war like John McCain, it's typically in the United States, it's United States culture to look at prisoners of war as heroes. Black people who were enslaved, whether or not they made it out of slavery or not, they should be afforded that same distinction. And the active efforts that they did to dismantle that horrible period of American history should be seen the same way as any people who fought for their own liberation. So after slavery, there was a movement that involved Black people working towards their own liberation and freedom through the Reconstruction period. During that time, you had the United States government had an opportunity to make some amends for this horrible thing that they did. And there were enough people within the federal government who believed that there should be land that was given to Black people, that Black people needed a measure of protection against hostile actors, those who had recently tried to fight to succeed. It was only reasonable to believe that they would resist against Black people advancing. And so for a very brief period, the right thing was done. The protections was given the promises were made, and Black people immediately went on to get political capital. And so that's where you had a Black governor that was elected in Louisiana. And this Black governor was elected because a white man strategically made PBS Pinchback his running mate for lieutenant governor because the Black voting bloc was so strong in Louisiana. You had both of the U.S. senators in Mississippi were Black, and you had Black members of the House of Representatives representing every southern state, and was representing them in proportion to the large population that the large Black population that they had in those southern states. But in the midst of all of that progress, and I do believe that even those white people who agreed that something should be done to help Black people after slavery, I think even they were concerned about the rapid pace of the progress that Black people were making during that time. And so there was a deal that was made between some of the Southerners to end Reconstruction and to remove all protective efforts for Black people in the South during that time. And that led to a lot of the early race riots that continued to happen for a decade. And these race riots, they were responsible for burning and looting Black businesses, getting rid of Black civil rights leaders and cultural icons. So it was really aimed at not just undoing the progress that we made, but was aimed at stunning progress for generations to come. And this was an action that the United States certainly bears some complicity with, and something that we need to really think about and understand that within the context of a lot of the disparities in income that we see today.
Thank you so much for that explanation and kind of making a connection between the enslavement of Black people and then Black progress, but then, of course, what was happening, during the post-Reconstruction era. And that kind of leads us into also talking about legalized segregation, right? So Jim Crow laws,
right.
Which you wrote about and said that started around 1866, these laws, and ended in 1965 with the passing of the Civil Rights Act. And so you said, or you wrote, and I quote, "The premature ending of Reconstruction, failure to provide Black people the promised land and equipment, and Plessy versus Ferguson led to Jim Crow laws." And I'm familiar with Jim Crow laws because both my parents, they're from the Deep South, actually. Even though I live in California now, we're all in California. But my parents talked to me about these Jim Crow laws and how they were affecting Black people. So, I was wondering if you can elaborate on Jim Crow laws and how they impacted Black people.
Yeah, so Jim Crow laws was essentially any justification for segregation and discrimination that was written into the law, either formally or implied. So there are specific actions that was desired by white people at the time. So it may be Black people not being able to own property in a certain area or own property at all, more desirable property. It may be Black people not being able to open up bank accounts or start businesses in certain areas, or attend different types of schools. So our vote. Anything that was specifically designed to uphold segregation and discrimination was a Jim Crow law. Now, the United States, very early on in its observation of seeing these things happen, had the opportunity to challenge it in federal court, in the highest court of the land, which is the Supreme Court. And so it was really during Plessy versus Ferguson that the United States had an opportunity to say that it's wrong. But what the United States did was it basically said that only half of it was wrong. So it was legal to segregate. There just needed to be equal in the segregation. So separate but equal. Now, it became very apparent very early on that the equal part was being completely ignored, and that people were using Plessy versus Ferguson in some very blatant and egregious ways to undermine any attempt at Black people being equal citizens in any given area. So the impact of that law became apparent very early. And it took almost 100 years for us to reverse that. It wasn't until we got to Brown versus Board of Education where we finally struck that down. But if an entity realizes that a decision that they made led to millions of people being disenfranchised over decades, then just reversing it and saying that you were wrong, I would say is insufficient for the impact of such a decision. And it's important for us to understand that because when we think about some of the accommodations that are made, and we can talk about reparations, but even the smallest accommodations like affirmative action programs or any type of entitlement programs, a lot of times there's these meritless claims that the United States should not be responsible for that. When we really do a deep dive into history, it's pretty apparent that simple things like having special funding for HBCUs and things like that is really the bare minimum that could and should be done, given the horrible impact of such a bad decision had on the consequences of millions of Black people.
Thank you so much. I appreciated what you had to say because you're right. Jim Crow laws had such a negative impact, such a harsh impact on Black people and Black progress. So I appreciate you talking about that. Okay, so something else that you talked about in your essay was COINTELPRO. So I want you to elaborate on that a little bit more. So for those of you who aren't familiar with COINTELPRO, that's the FBI's counterintelligence program. And it had to do with the illegal surveillance of civil rights groups such as the Black Panthers and civil rights activists such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And so the goal of this program was to expose, to disrupt, to discredit, and really just to stop any possible threat against the existing social order. So, this is really speaking to white supremacy, right? And so, yes, Dr. Toldson, I would love for you to elaborate more on this program since it was something that you talked about.
Yeah, so this is a program that a lot of people don't know much about. I learned about it when I was in high school, And at the time, I was investigating topics to do a term paper on, and my teacher initially rejected that topic, telling me that it was not true. And I had to really, challenge her and to make a fuss about it for her to finally let me do it. And at the end, she didn't acknowledge the veracity of my paper or anything like that. She just kind of let it go. But she did tell me at my graduation that I could be something. This is her quote: "I could be something special if I just got rid of my anger." But even to this day, I've taught at two historically Black colleges or two historically Black universities, and when I ask my students if they've heard of COINTELPRO, a lot of times they have not heard of it. And when we think about who was affected by COINTELPRO, these are largely people who would be in their 70s today. So if you're in the X generation, my generation, they're our parents. If you're a millennial, they're probably your grandparents. But this is something that happened, very early on. Now, during the time of the 1940s on through the 1970s, there were movements of Black people, and we can, look at movements like the Garvey movement, Back to Africa, and one of the earliest Black nationalists. And then we could look at movements like the civil rights movements and the New Negro movement, when all of these Black people were coming back from Germany and from Europe, other places in Europe because of World War II. And of course, the civil rights movement that was led by Martin Luther King. And then immediately afterwards, you had the Black Power movements, where you had organizations like the Black Panther Party. And you also had, religious movements like the Nation of Islam. So all of these movements caught the attention of the United States government, and there were efforts, mostly spearheaded by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, to suppress these organizations. And so, there were informants that was implanted in these organizations. The informants were there to do things to discredit them, to incite violence between these organizations and local police departments, are various Black organizations. A lot of you all probably saw the Fred Hampton movie, but in that case, it was assassinations that happened. So all of these things, were happening during probably the first time in Black history where Black organizations, Black associations, Black religious movements, Black institutions were gaining international prominence. This was during the time when other countries were looking at Black movements for Black American movements for inspiration on how to resist things like colonialism and empiricism. And all of this was happening covert. Many of the leaders of these organizations were falsely accused of crimes. And so you have people who was gaining lots and lots of traction in the United States, Black people, as charismatic leaders, were put in prison at the peak of their popularity, the peak of their movement, and left in prison for long enough for the movements to die down. So we have to consider the effect, the impact of that on our development today. there are movements that deserve the opportunity to thrive and that deserve the opportunity to lawfully protest the things that they found unjust about what was going on in this country. We still probably would not know that this happened except for a group of vigilantes that called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. They found a way to break into a field office, an FBI field office in Pennsylvania, and they stole all of these files. And that's how we know about the extent of these activities. We know that they use the term Black Messiah. We know that they tried to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide. We know that they mention all of these prominent Black leaders that we know in our history by name as enemies of the state. And so that's something that we all should know about, and we should all be sensitive to the impact that that probably had on our current standing in this nation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Toldson, for that thorough explanation. Yeah, it's something that is always discussed in the Black community, but you're right to actually kind of research it and say, okay, no, this really did happen. It is really important, I think, for everyone to know that this is real, and that Black civil rights groups, Black civil rights activists were being targeted by the FBI. And it was allowed to happen. Okay. And then one last thing that you mentioned, Dr. Toldson, in your essay was the relation between crack cocaine and mass incarceration. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, just how with the introduction of crack cocaine into the Black community, we saw an increase in mass incarceration. So if you could elaborate and talk about that and how that has impacted the Black community today, that would be really great.
Yeah, well, this is another instance where the United States government made a mistake and they admitted to that mistake. But Black people had lots of consequences for that mistake. And we need to really think about that. But, during the Cold War in the 1980s, there were efforts that was being taken by the United States government to try to suppress a resistance movement that was aligned to communists in Nicaragua by providing arms to the Contras, which was a rebel group there that aligned themselves to the West, and who made a strategic decision to try to cozy up to the United States so that they can get support. The Congress at that time did not think that it was right for the United States government to support them. They voted not to provide the Reagan administration with funding for the Contras. And so through a clandestine operation within the federal government, they arranged for payments to be made to Iran for weapons, and found a way for a third party to use profits from the sale of arms to the Iranian government to provide funding for the Contras in Nicaragua. At the same time, the Contras were also funding their efforts through drug sales to the United States. And so during that time, there were gaping holes that appeared in security, which allowed the Contras to supply drugs, mostly through Los Angeles, through Southern California, but through other ports in the United States. And the CIA was actively involved with the Contras at that time It's been demonstrated through congressional hearings that the CIA was involved with all areas of the Contras getting the resources that certain people in the United States government thought they needed to advance their cause. What we know is that it's very hard to believe that the CIA knew nothing about the Contras supplying drugs to the United States for profit. And it's reasonable to believe, and members of our own Congress has brought this up, but it's reasonable to believe that the CIA could have facilitated it. Now, this is all, this isn't conspiracy theory. These are things that were subject to congressional hearings. The CIA themselves did an internal audit of this at the request of Black leaders. But we know the impact of having these powerful drugs come in the Black community and having crack happen at the same time. But then at the same time, we had these draconian drug laws. So even though there was knowledge within the government that drugs were coming to the Black community through this thing that was happening in Nicaragua, they still passed measures that criminalized drug use to the point where there was a 700% rise in the Black prison population, where they looked at the same drug that was coming through these clandestine means as something that could give you 15 years to life in federal prison. Only enough that can fit in the palm of your hand can get you 15 years. And they had a 1 to 100 ratio in terms of the amount of time you can get for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Now we know recently, we know that the United States knows how to treat drug problems differently. We know that through the opioid crisis, where it's been seen as more of a public health problem, not a criminal problem. So the things that happened during the 80s and the 90s from the Iran-Contra scandal and the measures, the drug enforcement measures that was passed under the Reagan administration and then the Clinton administration. We know the impact that that's had on the Black community. We still feel it to this day, and it's no telling what we could have accomplished during that time when most of our major cities were majority Black, where you had truly chocolate cities that was in a position to advance many enterprises. We had this a really bad chapter where we were flooded with drugs and then subsequently punished to the point of just really weakening our position in these cities. So, we really have to think about that in full context to, what was done to us and what is the responsibility of the people who are culpable for that.
Thank you for that explanation, Dr. Toldson. And of course, with all of the points that Dr. Toldson and I have kind of brought up today, if you're not fully familiar with, some of this information, definitely go look it up. We only have so much time in an hour to address everything in a great deal of detail, but I think Dr. Toldson has been doing such an excellent job. So just again, to kind of recap what we've been talking about for people who kind of jumped on a little bit later, Dr. Toldson and I, we started with the enslavement of Black people. and how that has impacted Black communities here in the United States. We then moved on to talking about the Reconstruction period and the post-Reconstruction massacres, and Dr. Toldson did a really good job kind of making the link between Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. He also talked about Jim Crow laws, right, which had to do with legalized segregation. And so when you kind of just think about everything, it's like, geez, can Black people just breathe? And can we just be allowed to, just live our lives and build without there always being something horrible being put into place to stop us? And then following the Jim Crow laws, I guess just given the time in which this starts, we're talking about the FBI's counterintelligence program and how that impacted so many of our Black leaders and civil rights groups, and then crack cocaine and mass incarceration just seems like it's not going to end. So do you have, but we always have hope, right? So do you have any last thoughts, before we go into the Q&A? Because people are starting to write questions already, and I want you to definitely address some of these questions. But any final thoughts and kind of reviewing this information with everyone? And again, I definitely think everyone should go and research these, these topics in more detail.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to understand the resilience of Black people. Considering all of these different things, to be where we are right now is nothing short of extraordinary. So that's something that we can all be proud of. I also think that, the United States is our nation. We built this nation. We deserve to have a part of this nation, and we deserve to be at the table when decisions are being made. And a lot of the issues that I talked about, it was because of either lack of representation or misguided representation. So representation matters. I've worked for the federal government. I participate civically. I participate in campaigns, and I'll donate to campaigns because this is our nation. And as I said before, when all of these bad things were happening, there's no time when the entire government was lockstep in doing the wrong thing. And so by us not acknowledging that these things happen, we run the risk of normalizing some of the worst things that's happened. So that would be my final take on this. That all of this history means that we need to be conscious and aware and take the stake that we deserve in this nation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I really liked what you had to say. You're right. This is our nation just as much as it is anyone else's. And this country was built, honestly, on the backs of Black people. And so you're right, we do deserve to have a place at the table when decisions are being made, instead of decisions always being made for us and about our lives. So I definitely think it is extraordinary that we are where we are. And, even though you and I started with the conversation on the enslavement of Black people, but to just think about, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit this month, Black History Month, just what our ancestors went through so that we could even be here today is absolutely extraordinary. So I think as a Black people, we always have hope, and we're always moving forward and overcoming all the different barriers and challenges that are put in our way. But like you said, we definitely are a resilient people. So thank you so much, Dr. Toldson. I do want to go ahead and get to some of these questions. I know you can see the questions in the Q&A too. There's a number of questions that just keep coming in. So let me see. Okay, so there are a couple questions related to the FBI's counterintelligence program. So let me see. Here's one. Is there anything that concerns you today along the lines of government repression?
Yes, and I see that
You
that's
know,
actually a friend of mine who posted that. How you doing, brother Adisa? We go way back. Um, yes, I mean, just at the end of the last administration, there was an executive action that was made that people were interpreting different ways. But a lot of interpretations of it was that you couldn't talk about things like critical race theory. You couldn't talk about oppression. I actually had a presentation that was. Uh, they told me to revise my presentation because I used the word oppressors in one of my slides based on that executive action. And this was the one that was prompted in resistance to the 1619 project. So there are things that happen like that, but then there's also things that like the and some of it isn't just obviously something that is against Black people. It's not like the crime bills had Black in it, but it can have a disparate impact. So things like the surveillance activities or the surveillance laws that happened after 9/11. We have to take a close look at that. With everything going on with Wall Street right now, I found out just recently that there was a law that was passed at the end of the Clinton administration, really during the lame duck period, which allowed for Wall Street to kind of act like a casino, to do all these betting on shorts, and really allowed the whole hedge fund movement to thrive. And 100% of the U.S. senators voted on that. Even Bernie Sanders voted on it. But it has a lot to do with the wealth gap that's happened right now. There's also, different biases that happen throughout the government and throughout the various agencies, where they may look at the activity of organization that is designed to uplift Black people with a more critical eye than some of our hard right types of organizations. So all of this history, means that we just have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that we're aware of some of the things that happen, some of the things that's passed. I remember when I was working with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, there was a bill that kept being introduced called the Gang Abatement Bill, and this was probably this was around the early 2010s, and luckily there was a cohort of CBC members who understood the danger of the way that bill was written, and so that bill never made it into law. But if that gang abatement bill would have made it into law, it would have, had more dangerous consequences, or would have furthered some of these horrible consequences of some of these crime bills that passed before it. So we just have to be aware of all of those things. Yes, there's still the propensity for things to happen right now. And there are laws that's already on the books that can give cover to some things that could have a disparate impact on Black people. So we constantly have to be aware of it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toldson. I'm looking in the Q&A, so there are about 2 or 3 questions that are kind of asking the same thing. So given this history, right, everything that we've talked about today, what can people do today to help address, a number of the issues that people are experiencing in Black communities?
Mm-hmm. some of the same things I said before. Be vigilant. Take a look at laws and bills every now and then. Know who represents you. Um, See what they are endorsing. Speak out about things that you don't like. There are people that do that, but it's just not enough of us. It's not in our normal conversation. So, we need to start, looking at a range of different things. We also need to advance, more conversations like this. Too much of what I talked about is just not known, and particularly among young people who are trying to understand where Black people fit in this society and want to have a good sense of what our capabilities are. They're really not given it in standard education. So we need to try to make sure that Black people know this history and know what they're capable of, and also know what our rights are, and be able to advance for what we deserve today within the proper context of why we need it. There are still some Black people that don't know, or people in general, that believe that our grievance is just for slavery. But as you see from this list, it's a whole lot more than slavery that we have to work to address. So every entitlement are, as I said before, the minimum that one should expect to even hint at addressing some of these things.
Thank you so much for what you said. I agree. So here's a question. What are your favorite book recommendations for white people or other holders of privilege who are wanting to increase cultural diversity?
Well, I mean, I have to recommend my own book, No BS, No Bad Stats. Black people need people who believe in Black people enough not to believe every bad thing they hear about Black people. I think it's a good book to give to help people understand the proper way to even think about these issues and some of the misinformation that we receive. Also talk about Black history in that, and some of the things that I talked about here, I talk about in the chapter in that book, Believing in Black People. Generally, I would say read on a range of topics and be very critical. I find a lot of value in just reading articles from a range of different sources, even Wikipedia entries, just to kind of get a sense of, things like COINTELPRO and understanding, some of the people in our history that has made, such a big impact. Looking at, some of the movements that's happened, and, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, and understanding, different things that's happened, like Tulsa. I find it's helpful to me just to read a lot of sketches of history and put a lot of things together.
Thank you so much. And here's another question. Do you think we'll ever live in a world where everyone is treated equally, no matter what color of skin? If so, how do we get there? I pray we do.
Yeah, I think it could happen. And I see progress, and there's certainly a resistance to that progress, and we also have to understand that certain structural systems need to be addressed. That's polluted with racism, but there's other isms in there that's also important. So we can't just, we may see a Black billionaire, but if a Black billionaire became a billionaire because of things that is unfair in this capitalist system, and because of corporate welfare and things like that, then we have to look at a bigger picture than that. So racial harmony is an objective, but it's an objective that's associated with just the United States overall becoming a more fair and equitable nation. How do we get there? We get it by understanding each other, by getting out of our bubbles, by reading, by adhering to principles of justice, by being involved. Diversity is going to happen, it's going to happen naturally. This will be a majority people of color nation within most of our lifetimes, around 2035. So we're going to see the natural demographic changes. The thing is, how do we take something that's already changing and make sure that it's equitable and just? And I believe that we have enough people in the United States to make that happen.
Thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, but I want to try to get to another question. Okay, so my sense is that the drug crisis first surfaced in communities of color and didn't generate any sort of meaningful federal response until it became evident that whites were also affected. Is that accurate?
What'd you say? What was the beginning of it?
Oh, it had to do with how drugs were introduced into the Black community and.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think bad behavior among white people is looked at differently as, from bad behavior among Black people. Even when we look at things like, school violence and, all types of things. So these biases are out there. They need to be called out the same way, the way that you did. But yeah, absolutely. We see differences in the way that this nation responds when it affects white people versus Black people.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Toldson. We are out of time. I know that, we experienced some technical issues in the very beginning, but I totally appreciate you being here. There are still questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you want to stick around and we can try to address these questions, but I just want to say thank you again. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I can tell by the questions in the Q&A that a lot of people got a lot of really great information from this talk. And I really do want to encourage everyone to go and research this information more, right? Like Dr. Toldson said, really read more on it, pick up his book, BS, Bad Stats. And I'll send an email to everyone too with a link to his book so you can see more about it and learn more about his other publications. But yes, thank you again, Dr. Toldson. I know your time is very precious.
Yeah, well, thank you again. This is very proactive on your part, just to, read a very short essay that I wrote and want to have a longer conversation about it. So I look forward to your future conversations because like I said before, this is very needed. And thank you to everybody who joined. Sorry I couldn't answer all of your questions, but we'll keep this conversation going.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for staying and listening. And I appreciate all of you. And there will be a recording available for you if you want to watch this again. Thank you so much. Bye.
And just looking at Elizabeth, it was the FBI that sent a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. trying to get him to commit suicide. So you can Google that and find a lot of information on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just kind of saw that in my.
Yeah. Okay. That's crazy.
Yeah.
All of it. Oh my goodness. Okay. Thank you again, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Dr. Toldson, stay on for just a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.